June 15, 1944. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon of Saipan, spilling pale gold across the black volcanic sand and jagged coral ridges. The sea behind the beach was still glowing from the flicker of naval gunfire, the air thick with the heavy metallic scent of cordite and smoke. Private First Class Tony Stein of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Marines, crouched low behind a mound of sandbags and shattered debris, his gloved hands resting on the cool steel of his Browning M1919 machine gun. Around him, the world was chaos, the sounds of artillery bursts echoing across the shoreline, the distant whine of mortars, and the rhythmic crash of waves that seemed almost indifferent to the carnage unfolding on land. Saipan was not just another island. It was the gateway to Japan's inner defense line, and every Japanese soldier on it had been ordered to die rather than surrender. The invasion had begun only hours before, but the resistance had already taken on a scale few Marines had ever imagined. The beaches that morning were supposed to be secured, but in the gray mist of early dawn, movement began to stir in the jungle beyond the ridge line, not the random movement of isolated snipers, but an organized wave. Tony's eyes caught it first, hundreds of dark figures spreading out, their bayonets flashing like sparks under the rising sun. He realized immediately what was coming. It wasn't a retreat. It was a Banzai charge, the kind of suicidal rush that turned battlefields into slaughterhouses in minutes. The Marine manual had rules for everything, especially for machine gunners. Hold fire until ordered. Conserve ammunition. Never break fire discipline. The Browning M1919 was a belt-fed, water-cooled beast, but even it could overheat and jam if pushed too hard. And ammunition wasn't infinite. Every belt fired had to be hauled ashore through surf and chaos. But theory evaporated the moment the jungle began to scream. Hundreds of Japanese infantrymen, driven by the code of Bushido, emerged from the tree-line with rifles, swords, and grenades. They moved as one, yelling with a ferocity that turned their cries into a single, thunderous roar. Tony could feel the sound through his chest before he even saw their faces. His assistant gunner, Corporal James or Waller, was already gone, killed minutes earlier by a mortar fragment. His squad leader had been hit and dragged back toward the beach. The radio line was cut. There were no officers nearby, no one to give orders. All Tony had was his gun, his training, and a choice that every soldier fears: follow the rules or survive. He watched them close the distance, a wave of bodies pouring across open ground. 75 yards. 60. 50. They were too many to count, but their shadows moved like one enormous creature. His finger hovered over the trigger. Every instinct screamed to wait, to let them get into the kill zone, to coordinate with the riflemen on the flanks. But there were no flanks anymore. To his left, another gun position had gone silent. To his right, a line of Marines was already retreating toward the shore. The charge was moving fast, and if it broke through, the entire beachhead would collapse. That's when Tony made his decision, not a dramatic one, not shouted, just a quiet, instinctive act of survival. He pressed the butterfly trigger and held it down. The Browning came alive with a metallic roar, spitting a steady, murderous stream of fire. The weapon's barrel glowed red within seconds as tracer rounds cut through the smoke, slicing into the oncoming ranks. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozen, their momentum turning to chaos as the lead ranks stumbled and collapsed. But still they came. The noise was deafening. The ground around Tony erupted with return fire, rifle cracks, grenade bursts, and screaming. Dirt exploded against his helmet. A grenade landed just yards away, its blast ripping through his sandbags and showering him with debris. He ignored it. He fired until his first belt ran dry, yanked another from the ammo box, and fed it into the receiver with hands slick from sweat and blood. The barrel smoked. Steam hissed from the water jacket. He could feel the vibration of the gun reverberating through his bones. The manual said never to fire more than a few short bursts at a time, but the manual had never seen 300 men charging at once. He kept the trigger down, sweeping side to side, every tracer marking the difference between survival and annihilation. By the time the enemy was within 40 yards, the air itself seemed alive with flying metal. The Banzai charge was faltering, but still not broken. Some soldiers crawled through the bodies, firing their Arisaka rifles as they advanced. Tony could see their faces now, gaunt, determined, shouting as they charged headlong into the wall of bullets. One Marine to his left tried to rise and fire his carbine, but was cut down instantly. The smell of burnt powder mixed with seawater and blood was overwhelming. Tony didn't think about doctrine or orders anymore. He thought about staying alive for another minute, another belt, another breath. His Browning rattled and shook, its barrel now white-hot, the recoil forcing him to brace his entire body behind it. He yelled over the noise, not words, just raw defiance, and kept firing until the ground before him became a tangle of bodies and shattered weapons. The first wave was gone, then the second, then a third that tried to circle from the right. He swung the gun toward them, firing at almost point-blank range. There was no more waiting, no more measured bursts. It was pure instinct and muscle memory, the sound of the weapon blending with the roar of the sea behind him. When the last echoes faded, Tony realized his ears were ringing with silence. Smoke hung low over the beach, and the rising sun turned it orange. The ground before his position was a wasteland. Hundreds of enemy soldiers lay motionless, their charge stopped barely 20 yards from his gun. His Browning's barrel was warped from heat, its water jacket hissing steam, but it had held out long enough. Around him, other Marines were slowly re-emerging from their foxholes, stunned by the carnage. The beach was saved, for now. Tony sat back, his face streaked with soot, his hands trembling as he reloaded a final belt, just in case. There was no celebration, no cheer, just the grim understanding that sometimes survival meant breaking every rule. His forbidden, point-blank burst had stopped what doctrine could not. Later, officers would study the battle and question the choices made that morning, but none could deny the truth written in the black sand before them. One gunner's defiance had turned the tide on that small corner of Saipan, proving once again that war was never fought in manuals, but in moments of desperate courage. As the smoke began to lift over the beaches of Saipan, the full magnitude of what had happened started to take shape. The black volcanic sand was scarred with hundreds of shell craters, burned fragments of driftwood, and twisted metal from amphibious craft that had never made it to shore. Here and there, Marines moved like shadows through the haze, silent, exhausted, their faces gray from soot and disbelief. The night before, they had been told that the beachhead would be secure by dawn, that the main Japanese resistance would be pushed inland within hours. Instead, the dawn had brought chaos, death, and a Banzai charge so massive that it threatened to erase the entire line. Private First Class Tony Stein, still crouched behind the wreckage of his gun emplacement, was at the center of that maelstrom. His position had been chosen for its field of fire, a shallow depression facing the jungle's edge, but now it resembled the surface of another planet, pockmarked and blackened by explosions. His assistant gunner was gone. His ammunition runner lay motionless a few feet away. All around him were fragments of rifles, spent shell casings, and blood-darkened sand. Yet amid the ruin, one thing stood clear. The Banzai charge had stopped dead at his line. The Marines who emerged from nearby foxholes could scarcely believe it. They had expected to see the Japanese pouring over their defenses, bayonets flashing, screams echoing. Instead, what lay before them was a carpet of enemy dead stretching nearly 100 yards. Some had fallen mid-stride, rifles clutched tight. Others were piled in grotesque mounds where Stein's Browning fire had caught them in the open. The devastation was total, a textbook display of what sustained automatic fire could do at close range. But the textbooks had never recommended firing like this. Tony had violated nearly every rule in the machine gunner's handbook, firing continuously without pause, overheating the barrel, burning through thousands of rounds in minutes. He had done what no manual could teach. He had acted with instinct, not obedience. And it had worked. That morning, his forbidden act had been the thin line between order and annihilation. The price, however, was written across his face: exhaustion, fear, and the kind of hollow stare that comes only from seeing what a man's weapon can do at full capacity. Word of what had happened began to spread down the line. The Marines called it the stand at the Black Beach. Officers came over, stepping gingerly among the fallen, assessing what remained of the defensive perimeter. One of them, a lieutenant whose own squad had been nearly wiped out, stopped in front of Tony's gun position. The Browning's barrel had warped from heat, the paint blistered and peeling. Steam hissed from the water jacket, a testament to the sheer volume of fire it had unleashed. The lieutenant just nodded silently. There were no reprimands, no lectures about fire discipline. Everyone understood that what had taken place here had not been strategy, it had been survival. Behind the silence lay an unspoken truth that every veteran learned eventually. In battle, doctrine bends under the weight of necessity. The manuals were written by men who had survived. The men who followed them too rigidly often didn't. Tony Stein had learned that in one night. As the hours passed, reinforcements landed. The beach became a moving field of activity, corpsmen tending to the wounded, engineers clearing mines, and rifle squads preparing to push inland. But for Tony, time seemed to slow. Every movement felt heavier, every sound sharper. His uniform was stiff with dried salt and blood, his gloves torn open from the recoil of the Browning. He helped replace the gun's barrel, checking the receiver, feeding new belts into the box. He worked quietly, mechanically, as if afraid that stopping would bring back the images he had just witnessed. He didn't speak to anyone for a long time. When another Marine tried to thank him, Tony only shook his head. There was no glory in what had happened. It was ugly, brutal, and necessary. He had seen the enemy up close, seen the look in their eyes as they charged forward knowing they would die. That image would stay with him far longer than the noise of battle. In the hours that followed, the Japanese mounted smaller, desperate attacks against the Marine perimeter. Most were repelled quickly, but the defenders were running on fumes. Ammunition was low. The beach was still under intermittent mortar fire from hidden positions inland. Every time a shell landed, the men would instinctively duck into whatever crater or depression they could find. The sand itself seemed alive with danger. And yet, through it all, Tony remained at his gun, scanning the tree-line, waiting. He had seen what could happen when you hesitated, when you waited too long for orders that might never come. The lesson had been burned into him, literally, in the heat scars across his hands and arms. His body ached, but his mind was alert. The instinct that had saved him once would have to save him again. Later that afternoon, as the tropical sun climbed higher, the beach began to stink of death. Flies gathered in black swarms over the fallen. The air was thick with rot and cordite. Marines tried to dig shallow trenches for cover, but the volcanic soil was unforgiving. Every shovelful revealed shards of coral and shrapnel. They were trapped between the ocean and the jungle, their world reduced to a few hundred yards of contested sand. From offshore, the Navy continued to pound the island's interior with artillery, each salvo shaking the earth beneath their feet. Yet despite the bombardment, the Japanese held on, their underground tunnels and caves absorbing the blows. For every bunker destroyed, another seemed to open somewhere else. The battle for Saipan was only beginning, and everyone knew it. That night, When the moon rose over the Pacific, Tony finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He sat on the beach beside his gun, staring out at the ocean. The waves reflected the moonlight in long silver streaks. Behind him, the sounds of war continued, the occasional rifle shot, the rumble of distant artillery. But for a few fleeting minutes, he felt disconnected from it all. He thought about home, about the small Ohio town he'd left behind, about the promises he'd made to return. He wondered if anyone back home could ever truly understand what this place looked like: the black sand, the smell of burning oil, the sound of men screaming through the smoke. Saipan wasn't a name, it was an ordeal. Every Marine who survived it would carry it forever. And yet, amid the chaos, Tony had found a kind of grim clarity. War wasn't about following orders or proving bravery. It was about moments when the world narrowed to one decision, one trigger pull, one heartbeat separating life from death. As dawn broke again over the island, the next phase of the battle began. Tanks rolled off the landing craft, their treads grinding through the sand. Infantry units advanced inland toward the ridges that loomed over the beaches. Tony's unit was ordered forward to support them. He slung the Browning over his shoulder, its weight familiar now, almost comforting. The blackened barrel was replaced, the gun freshly oiled, but he could still feel the ghost of its recoil in his arms. As they moved inland, the landscape changed, from open beach to dense jungle, from sunlight to shadow. Every step brought new dangers: snipers hidden in the trees, mines buried underfoot, and sudden bursts of machine gun fire from unseen pillboxes. The Japanese had prepared this island for death, and they intended to take every invader with them. Moving through the thick vegetation, Tony could hear the distant echoes of other firefights, bursts of automatic fire, shouted commands, the rumble of grenades. He had no way of knowing it, but his stand at the beach had already become a story spreading among the Marines, a whispered legend of the gunner who broke every rule to save his unit. Yet for Tony, there was no sense of heroism. There was only the next ridge to climb, the next gun nest to silence. The battle had entered a new phase, one that would test not just courage but endurance. For the men of Saipan, there would be no easy victories, only survival bought one bullet at a time. By the second day on Saipan, the black sand beaches had become the graveyard of two armies. The shattered remains of landing craft lay half buried at the water's edge, their hulls twisted by artillery fire. The smell of smoke and death clung to the air like a fog that would never lift. For Tony Stein and the men of the 24th Marines, there was no time to dwell on what they had survived. Orders came down just after sunrise: push inland, seize the ridgeline, link up with the 2nd Marine Division advancing from the north. The battle that had begun on the beach was now moving into the heart of the island, where the terrain would favor the defenders. Saipan's jungles and coral ridges were a maze of tunnels, caves, and machine gun nests. The Japanese defenders knew every inch of it. What awaited the Marines was a battlefield unlike anything they had trained for, a labyrinth of death, where every rock might hide a rifle barrel, every cave an ambush waiting to unfold. Tony, carrying his Browning and 2 spare barrels slung over his shoulder, felt the weight of the weapon pressing against his back like a second spine. Around him, the platoon advanced in silence, boots crunching against the dry volcanic soil. The ocean faded behind them, replaced by the hum of insects and the whisper of jungle leaves. The sounds of battle came in bursts, short, sharp exchanges echoing through the trees. As the Marines pressed forward, they encountered the first signs of the enemy's underground fortress. Caves had been carved deep into the limestone ridges, connected by tunnels that allowed the Japanese to vanish and reappear miles away. It was as if the island itself was alive and fighting back. Every few yards, the Marines halted to clear a cave with grenades and flamethrowers. The heat was unbearable. Sweat soaked through their uniforms, and the air was so thick with humidity that it felt like breathing through cloth. The tension never broke, it only grew heavier. Every shadow looked like a trap. Every rustle of leaves sounded like an ambush. For Tony, the Browning was both a burden and a lifeline. It was heavy, nearly 30 pounds without ammunition, but its presence was reassuring. It had saved his life once. He trusted it more than anything else. By midday, they reached a small ridge overlooking a ravine. Below them, Japanese troops were dug in among the rocks, their machine guns positioned to cover every approach. The Marines fanned out, trying to flank them, but the defenders were ready. A burst of automatic fire tore through the trees, forcing the men to dive for cover. The noise was deafening. Bullets snapped through branches and ricocheted off stone. Tony hit the dirt, dragging the Browning into position. His assistant gunner, a replacement barely 19 years old, dropped beside him, fumbling with the ammunition belt. Tony shouted over the gunfire to stay low, then squeezed the trigger. The Browning thundered again, its steady rhythm filling the jungle with the sound of power and defiance. He aimed for the flashes of enemy muzzle fire, walking his tracers across the rocks. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, familiar now, almost comforting in its violence. One by one, the Japanese gun positions fell silent. The Marines advanced a few yards, then halted as another burst came from a hidden bunker on the left. Tony shifted his position, adjusted his sights, and fired again. Short, precise bursts this time, learning from the mistakes of the beach. The enemy fire dwindled, replaced by the distant sound of men shouting orders in Japanese. The firefight lasted less than 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When it was over, the ravine was quiet except for the low crackle of burning brush. The Marines moved cautiously through the clearing, rifles raised, checking for survivors. Tony sat back against a rock, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He could feel the familiar ache in his arms and shoulders, the price of handling the Browning for hours at a time. His assistant gunner brought him a canteen, and Tony drank in silence. Around them, the squad began to take stock. Casualties were light, but everyone looked older than they had that morning. The battle had stripped away whatever innocence they had left. Saipan was teaching them lessons no manual could ever describe, lessons about endurance, instinct, and the thin line between courage and fear. As the unit regrouped, a sense of unease hung in the air. The Japanese weren't retreating, they were repositioning. Every ridge they captured came at the cost of another ambush waiting just ahead. The Marines had learned to move cautiously, to trust their instincts over the map. They advanced slowly, clearing each cave with precision, using grenades and flamethrowers to flush out defenders. The screams that followed were horrific, the sound of war reduced to its rawest, most primitive form. Tony tried not to think about it, but the noise stayed with him long after each engagement. At night, when the jungle went quiet, he could still hear it, the echo of fire, the cries of men, the mechanical stutter of his own gun repeating in his mind. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sounds of distant explosions and the rustle of unseen movement. Every night, the Japanese launched small infiltration attacks, crawling through the dark to throw grenades or stab sentries before vanishing into the shadows. The Marines learned to sleep with their fingers on their triggers, every nerve stretched thin. By the fourth day, the push inland had turned into a brutal grind. The Marines were low on supplies. Ammunition had to be carried by hand through miles of mud and the tropical heat made every movement a test of will. Tony's Browning, once a symbol of control and power, now felt like an anchor dragging him deeper into exhaustion. His hands were blistered and raw from the constant firing. Yet every time the enemy appeared, he found the strength to pull the trigger again. The machine gun's rhythm became a heartbeat, steady, mechanical, unrelenting. It was his anchor, the one constant in a world gone mad. One afternoon, Near the base of Mount Tapachau, the island's central high ground, Tony's unit encountered one of the fiercest Japanese counterattacks of the campaign. Hundreds of soldiers poured out of the jungle, screaming, their bayonets gleaming in the sunlight. It was another Banzai charge, larger than the one on the beach. The Marines opened fire with everything they had, rifles, machine guns, mortars, but the sheer momentum of the attack was terrifying. Tony set up the Browning on a pile of rocks and unleashed a stream of fire that tore through the oncoming ranks. The gun bucked violently, the barrel glowing as the air filled with smoke. Bullets kicked up dirt inches from his position, but he didn't stop. His assistant gunner fed the belts as fast as he could, shouting to be heard over the noise. The world became a blur of movement and sound. Explosions, screams, the metallic clatter of spent casings falling at his knees. It was chaos, and yet Tony moved with calm precision, his every motion automatic, drilled into him by instinct and necessity. When the attack finally broke, the hillside was littered with bodies. The ground was scorched, the trees shredded by gunfire. The surviving Marines moved among the wreckage, dazed but alive. Tony's Browning was smoking again, the barrel nearly molten, but it had held out. The lieutenant, who had witnessed his defense on the beach, approached him once more, placing a hand on his shoulder. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say. They both understood what had just happened. Once again, Tony's defiance of textbook discipline had saved lives. He had become something more than a gunner now. He was the embodiment of what combat demanded: adaptability, instinct, and courage beyond reason. That night, as the Marines dug in at the base of the mountain, Tony sat cleaning his weapon by moonlight. His hands were steady, his face illuminated by the faint glow of a cigarette. Around him, the jungle crackled with distant gunfire. He thought about the men who hadn't made it, the faces that had vanished into smoke and memory. War, he realized, was not about glory or victory. It was about endurance, the ability to keep going when everything inside you screamed to stop. He looked down at the Browning resting across his knees, its metal scarred and blackened from heat, and he understood that this weapon was both his burden and his salvation. Tomorrow, the battle would continue. Tomorrow, more men would die. But tonight, for a few brief hours, he allowed himself the small comfort of knowing that he had done what was necessary, not what was taught, not what was ordered, but what was right in the chaos of war. By the time the battle for Saipan entered its final week, the island had been transformed into a graveyard of machines and men. The lush green hills were now scorched black, pitted with craters, and littered with the wreckage of tanks, rifles, and shattered helmets. The air was thick with humidity, and the constant hum of flies that hovered over the fallen. The Marines had fought for every inch of ground, their progress marked by blood and exhaustion. For Private First Class Tony Stein, each new day felt heavier than the last. His body was pushed beyond endurance, his hands permanently marked by burns from overheated barrels. Yet despite the toll, he refused to leave his gun. The Browning M1919 had become an extension of his own will, the rhythm of its firing almost indistinguishable from his own heartbeat. Around him, the men no longer saw him as just another Marine. They called him the man who wouldn't stop. The inland campaign reached its crescendo at the cliffs near Marpy Point, the northern tip of the island. Here, the Japanese defenders made their last desperate stand. They had no hope of victory, but surrender was unthinkable. Their commanders ordered a final gyokusai, the ritual mass suicide charge meant to die with honor rather than be captured. Hundreds of soldiers, some wounded, some barely armed, assembled at dawn for the last Banzai attack. They charged down the slope in a frenzy of shouting and gunfire. For the Marines, it was a nightmare made real. Entire units were overrun in minutes as the Japanese came forward with bayonets, grenades, even sharpened sticks. Tony and his squad were positioned near the center of the line, overlooking a narrow valley that funneled the attackers directly toward them. The order was simple: hold the line, no matter the cost. As the first waves appeared, Tony set his Browning on its tripod, the barrel already scorched from previous firefights. He checked the feed, tightened the belt, and braced himself. The jungle ahead erupted in movement. Hundreds of dark figures poured out, screaming, charging headlong through the smoke. There was no hesitation this time, no waiting for permission. Tony opened fire, the weapon roaring to life with the fury of a thunderstorm. Tracers streaked through the dawn mist, cutting through the ranks of onrushing soldiers. The recoil jolted his arms, but he didn't stop. Belt after belt fed through the receiver as his assistant gunner worked feverishly beside him. The noise was overwhelming. The staccato hammer of machine guns, the dull thump of grenades, the cries of men locked in hand-to-hand combat. The air was alive with motion and sound, a single, endless roar that blurred into madness. Actions, though he never mentioned it to anyone. For him, it wasn't heroism, it was survival. He had seen too much to believe in glory. When he finally returned home months later, the war followed him like a shadow. Crowds cheered the returning Marines, flags waved, and bands played, but in his eyes, there was no celebration, only memory. The screams of the Banzai charge, the heat of the Browning, the smell of burning flesh, these things didn't fade with time. They lived on in every silence, in every night that refused to let him sleep. He often said little about Saipan, only that it had burned the boy out of him. Friends described him as quiet, humble, and distant, a man who carried something unspoken behind his eyes. Years later, military historians would write about the defense of the Saipan beachhead and the lone gunner who held his ground when everyone else fell back. They called it the Forbidden Stand. Some argued that his defiance set a dangerous precedent, that war should not be left to instinct. Others, especially the men who fought beside him, knew better. They knew that in the chaos of battle, when orders cannot be heard and logic gives way to survival, the only law that matters is the will to fight. Tony Stein embodied that truth. His choice had not only saved lives, it had redefined what courage meant in the face of annihilation. In the end, Tony's legacy was not just written in the sands of Saipan, but in the understanding that war is fought not by perfect soldiers following perfect orders, but by flawed, frightened men who rise to meet impossible moments. His story became a quiet legend among Marines, passed down not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson in instinct, defiance, and the thin line between chaos and control. The Browning M1919 that had saved his life was eventually decommissioned, its metal scarred and worn smooth from his hands. Some said he kept a single shell casing from that day, polished and silent, a reminder of the decision that had defined him. When future generations studied the war, they saw in Tony's story the essence of what it meant to fight in the Pacific, not the grand strategies or the speeches, but the raw humanity of one man standing alone against the impossible. On June 15, 1944, on a strip of black volcanic sand, a 19-year-old Marine had shown that sometimes the forbidden path is the only one that leads to survival. And as the waves of Saipan washed quietly against the shore, long after the echoes of battle had faded, the island remembered, not the orders given, but the courage it took to disobey them. Actions, though he never mentioned it to anyone. For him, it wasn't heroism, it was survival. He had seen too much to believe in glory. When he finally returned home months later, the war followed him like a shadow. Crowds cheered the returning Marines, flags waved, and bands played, but in his eyes, there was no celebration, only memory. The screams of the Banzai charge, the heat of the Browning, the smell of burning flesh, these things didn't fade with time. They lived on in every silence, in every night that refused to let him sleep. He often said little about Saipan, only that it had burned the boy out of him. Friends described him as quiet, humble, and distant, a man who carried something unspoken behind his eyes. Years later, military historians would write about the defense of the Saipan beachhead and the lone gunner who held his ground when everyone else fell back. They called it the forbidden stand. Some argued that his defiance set a dangerous precedent, that war should not be left to instinct. Others, especially the men who fought beside him, knew better. They knew that in the chaos of battle, when orders cannot be heard and logic gives way to survival, the only law that matters is the will to fight. Tony Stein embodied that truth. His choice had not only saved lives, it had redefined what courage meant in the face of annihilation. In the end, Tony's legacy was not just written in the sands of Saipan, but in the understanding that war is fought not by perfect soldiers following perfect orders, but by flawed, frightened men who rise to meet impossible moments. His story became a quiet legend among Marines, passed down not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson in instinct, defiance, and the thin line between chaos and control. The Browning M1919 that had saved his life was eventually decommissioned, its metal scarred and worn smooth from his hands. Some said he kept a single shell casing from that day, polished and silent, a reminder of the decision that had defined him. When future generations studied the war, they saw in Tony's story the essence of what it meant to fight in the Pacific, not the grand strategies or the speeches, but the raw humanity of one man standing alone against the impossible. On June 15, 1944, on a strip of black volcanic sand, a 19-year-old Marine had shown that sometimes the forbidden path is the only one that leads to survival. And as the waves of Saipan washed quietly against the shore, long after the echoes of battle had faded, the island remembered, not the orders given, but the courage it took to disobey them.